But we need to know where she is. We need her to come home. For that reason, we are offering a family reward of up to $1 million for any information that leads us to her recovery. Someone out there knows something that can bring her home. Somebody knows. We are begging you to please come forward now.
This morning, almost a month after Nancy Guthrie went missing, investigators still combing through surveillance footage from the area around her house. Yesterday, this new Ring camera video emerging, obtained by Fox News Digital, showing a car driving down a street around 2:30 a.m. the night Nancy was taken. The street about 2.5 miles from her home, just outside that 2-mile perimeter where investigators had asked neighbors for any video they might have to help the case. The sheriff department saying they're aware of the car video. Authorities trying to piece together the puzzle of what happened to Nancy and answer the many questions that still remain, many of them on the minds of Savannah's loyal viewers who have flooded us with questions since Nancy went missing. One of the biggest, how did the suspect get into Nancy's home? We've asked the sheriff that several times. It's one of the things he just won't answer.
How do you think the suspect got into the home? Was the door unlocked? Did they have a key?
So I'm not going to go into whether that's forced entry, not forced entry, or my suspicions.
The sheriff also won't say if any blood was found inside the house, where the unknown mixed DNA was found at the property, or what other evidence they've sent out for testing, and if anything other than Nancy was taken from the home.
When you're transparent, it doesn't mean you just open your whole investigation up.
As for the current state of the case, one of you asked, what does it mean that the home is being given back to the Guthrie family? Former FBI Special Agent Brianna Fox says it's a standard part of the investigative process.
A month ago, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie triggered one of the most intense search operations the state had ever seen. Helicopters, tactical teams, crime scene tape. Now, the house is quiet. The FBI has pulled most of its agents out of the city. The command post is gone. The front yard no longer belongs to investigators. It belongs to the family again. And a new security sign stands where forensic vans once parked, like a message that the physical search is over. And because the real hunt has moved somewhere else, into phone records, into behavioral patterns, into relationships. More than 23,000 tips, $1 million reward. And investigators are no longer asking who took her. They are asking, who knows what happened, and why haven't they spoken? Tonight, this is not the story of a disappearance. This is the story of pressure, psychological pressure, closing in on someone who may already be inside the circle of trust. Yet because rewards like this are not designed to find strangers. They are designed to make someone break. And the most disturbing question of all is no longer where Nancy Guthrie is, but whether the FBI already knows who they're waiting for. This is Crime Case Examiner, where we don't just follow true crime. We dissect the psychology, the strategy, and the silent shifts that signal when a case is about to crack. If you're new here, I subscribe now and join a global community that tracks these investigations in real time. And as you watch, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this case has crossed every border, and every perspective matters. Because what's happening right now in this investigation is the phase where someone, somewhere, starts to feel the walls closing in. The phase where someone, somewhere, starts to feel the walls closing in, never looks dramatic from the outside. And there are no flashing lights, no urgent radio chatter, no search teams moving shoulder to shoulder across the desert. Instead, it looks like stillness. The kind of stillness that settled over the Tucson foothills when the physical search for Nancy Guthrie gave way to something far more methodical and far more dangerous for the person responsible. Because when investigators stop running, it usually means they've started thinking. And thinking is what solves organized crimes. For weeks, the house had been frozen in time. Every surface processed, every inch photographed, every trace of movement documented and logged by the joint effort between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Then, almost without ceremony, it ended. The property was released. The crime scene tape came down, and for the first time since that night in February, the front door no longer belonged to the state. It belonged to the family again, to the outside world. Won't it look like a step back? To investigators, it meant something very different. Everything the house was going to give them, it had already given. Which raises the question that sits at the center of this entire phase of the case. If the answer is no longer inside the home, where is it? The new sign in the yard, the freshly installed security system, was not just about protection. It was a boundary, a quiet declaration that the spectacle had moved elsewhere. And because the investigation itself had moved elsewhere, to Phoenix, inside a building where there are no camera crews, no daily press briefings, just analysts, screens, timelines, and data. An ocean of data. More than 23,000 tips. Each one a fragment of human behavior. Each one a possibility. Each one a lie, a mistake, a misunderstanding, or the truth. This is the stage of a case the public almost never understands, and the absence of visible activity creates the illusion that momentum has been lost. But for the offender, the person who planned, who executed, who walked away from that house in the early morning hours, this is the stage that begins to erode confidence. Because this is the stage where investigators stop looking for a person and start building one. The early days were about urgency. Who was in the neighborhood? What vehicles were seen? Which direction did they go? But organized offenders don't get caught in those first chaotic sweeps. They plan for them. They rely on them. They count on the fact that noise hides detail. Now the noise is gone, and what's left is pattern. Pattern is the language of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Phone activity that deviates from routine. Devices that go dark for carefully selected windows of time. Movements that make sense geographically, but not behaviorally. Because a person can rehearse how to enter a home, and they can rehearse how to disable a camera. They can rehearse how to leave without waking a neighborhood. But what they cannot fully rehearse is how to stop being themselves. And that is where the real investigation begins. The $1 million reward changed the psychological landscape overnight. When Savannah Guthrie looked into the camera and made the offer, it wasn't just a plea for help. It was a signal to someone who had already chosen silence. Our rewards of that size are not fishing expeditions. They are pressure devices. They are designed with a specific type of person in mind. The one who knows something, but doesn't believe they will ever have to say it. A friend, a relative, a colleague. Someone who noticed a change in routine. Someone who heard a sentence that didn't sound right. Someone who has been carrying a private suspicion and trying to convince themselves it means nothing. For that person, and the reward creates a new internal conversation. How long can I stay quiet? How much is loyalty worth? What happens if someone else talks first? This is why tip numbers matter. Not because they produce immediate arrests, but because they produce repetition. Names that appear more than once. Locations that resurface from unrelated callers. Behavioral descriptions that begin to align. Investigators call it convergence. And convergence doesn't happen in public. It happens on screens, in spreadsheets, in the slow construction of a relational map. That map does not start with strangers. It starts with proximity. Who knew Nancy's routine? Who understood her medical needs? Who could approach her door without triggering fear? Because the crime itself, quiet, controlled, efficient, speaks to familiarity. Not necessarily emotional closeness, but functional closeness. The kind that allows a person to exist inside someone else's life without drawing attention. Somewhere in Tucson, there is a person who has been watching this shift unfold. At first, the search teams gave them comfort. Search teams mean uncertainty. Search teams mean distance. Search teams mean the possibility that the investigation is looking in the wrong place. But data is different. Data does not get tired. Data does not lose focus. Data does not care about appearances. And most importantly, data does not forget. For that person, the reward is no longer a headline. It is a clock. Every news update, or every interview, every reminder that the offer still stands is another moment where someone they know might decide to talk. This is how isolation begins. Not through interrogation rooms, but through imagination. Who have I told too much? Who is looking at me differently? Why did they ask that question? Why did that detective knock on that door? Meanwhile, to the public, the case appears suspended. No suspect, no arrest, no dramatic breakthrough. But beneath that still surface, something precise is happening. The construction of a behavioral timeline, not of Nancy's last hours, but of everyone connected to her world. Because in cases like this, time does not only belong to the victim, it belongs to the offender and to the people around them. When analysts reconstruct a timeline, they are not just asking, where was this person? They are asking, was that normal? Was that consistent with every other day of their life? Did their phone behave the way it always behaves? Did their movements follow the patterns they've followed for years? Or was there a single, carefully chosen deviation? A gap, a silence, a moment where the digital version of that person disappeared. The public hears the phrase, "no suspect identified," and assumes investigators are still searching for direction. But in reality, that phrase often means something else. It means the direction exists, but it is not yet ready to be revealed. Because once a name enters the public space, everything changes, behavior changes, stories change, memories change, and investigators lose the ability to watch that person in their natural state. So they wait, and while they wait, they apply pressure in ways that are almost invisible. Through media, through rewards, through time. Time is the one element no offender can control. The longer the silence lasts, the more variables enter the equation. More tips, more analysis, more people rethinking what they thought they saw, heard, yet or dismissed. Because human memory is not static. It reshapes itself around new information. And every new headline about the reward reshapes someone's memory. There is a moment in every organized investigation where the focus narrows. Not publicly, but internally. Where the list of possibilities becomes a smaller list of probabilities. Where the relational map begins to highlight the same cluster of names. Where the timeline begins to show the same anomaly. That moment is never announced. But it is the moment when a case turns. In Tucson, the search may look like it has gone quiet, but for one person, or for a small number of people, it has never been louder. Because they understand something the public does not. The physical search was the beginning. This phase is the part that finds you. And the most unsettling reality of all is this. By the time the world hears a name, the investigators may have been watching that person for weeks, measuring their behavior, comparing their patterns, waiting for the smallest fracture in their routine, or for the phone call, or for the tip, or for the moment when the weight of that $1 million reward becomes heavier than the secret itself. And when that moment comes, It will not look like a breakthrough. It will look like a decision, a private one, made by someone who has been silent until now. Which brings us back to the question that now defines this entire investigation. In a case that has moved away from the desert, away from the house, away from the visible search, who is the investigation really closing in on? And how much longer can that person live inside their own routine before the pattern gives them away? The problem with secrets inside a closed circle is that they don't behave like evidence. They behave like pressure. And by the time session 1 ended, that pressure had begun to shift the shape of everything. Not in public, not in a press conference, but in the quiet places where investigators sit with files open, photographs spread across a table, timelines drawn and redrawn until the ink begins to bleed through the paper. Because the new focus on Nancy's inner circle didn't just introduce a person of interest, it rearranged the meaning of the night she disappeared. The last verified movements that once looked ordinary, a routine evening, unfamiliar surroundings, known faces, started to feel staged. Not in the theatrical sense, in the psychological sense. Controlled environments, limited witnesses, predictable behavior patterns. And the more analysts mapped her final hours against the routines of the people closest to her, the more one disturbing possibility began to emerge. Someone didn't just know where Nancy would be. Someone knew who she would trust. That distinction matters, because stranger crimes are chaotic. But crimes that form inside a relationship follow emotional logic. They are built on access, timing, and an understanding of the victim's private world. And when investigators began re-examining Nancy's communications, not just calls and messages, but tone, frequency, gaps, they found something that had been overlooked in the early urgency of the case. A change, subtle, but measurable, in the weeks before she vanished. And her contact pattern with one person had shifted from casual to concentrated. Longer exchanges, late-hour interactions. Then, suddenly, silence. Not a gradual fading. A stop. For a behavioral analyst, that kind of break is rarely random. It suggests conflict, or fear, or a decision. And decisions create motive. By the time this pattern was fully understood, the reward had already transformed the case in another way. Because money does not just attract information, it destabilizes loyalty. People who once protected each other begin to calculate. Memories become negotiable. Alibis develop cracks. And the investigators didn't need a confession. They needed inconsistency, which is exactly what began to surface. Not dramatic contradictions. Not the kind that make headlines. Small things. A time that shifted by 20 minutes. A detail about who left first. A description of Nancy's mood that no longer matched the others. Individually, meaningless. Collectively, a psychological fracture. And fractures lead somewhere. The FBI's role at this stage was not visible in the way people imagine. There were no tactical teams, no flashing lights. What they brought was structure. They reconstructed movement patterns, not just Nancy's, but everyone connected to her during that critical window. Who called whom? Who changed their routine? Who had a device that went silent? Who appeared digitally present, but physically unaccounted for? Because in modern investigations, absence is data. And in this case, absence began to cluster around one person. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to change the way questions were asked. Earlier interviews had been broad, sympathetic, almost protective. Now they became precise, repetitive, strategic. The same question, different wording. The same timeline, approached from a different direction. And psychologically, that kind of questioning does something very specific. It forces a person to relive a constructed version of events, over and over, until the construction starts to fail. Friends and acquaintances noticed the change first, not investigators. They saw the strain, the irritability, the sudden insistence on being misunderstood, the quiet distancing from shared spaces and mutual contacts. These are not proof of guilt, but they are classic indicators of cognitive load. The stress created when someone has to maintain a narrative that doesn't align with reality. And then came the detail that shifted the emotional gravity of the case. A piece of information that had existed from the beginning, but had never been interpreted in context. Nancy had made a decision shortly before she disappeared. A personal decision. One that affected her relationship with someone inside that circle. Yet investigators began to see her final days not as a continuation of her normal life, but as a transition. And transitions create risk, especially for the person who stands to lose control. Because when you profile crimes rooted in personal relationships, the motive is rarely rage alone. It's fear of change, fear of exposure, fear of abandonment, fear of losing the version of reality that benefits you. And that fear, if it exists, does not erupt without warning. It leaks in tone, in body language, in offhand comments that seem harmless until you understand what they mean. Witnesses began recalling moments they had dismissed, a tense exchange, a look that lasted too long, a conversation that ended abruptly when someone entered the room. Memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. And the reward gave people a reason to reconstruct more carefully. Meanwhile, analysts returned to the physical evidence, not to find something new, but to reinterpret what was already there. Because when you change your suspect profile, you change what evidence means. A location that once felt random now looked familiar. A time gap that once seemed irrelevant now aligned with a known movement. A missing piece no longer felt like absence. It felt like removal. Intentional. And intentional behavior tells you about psychology. This was not impulsive. If the emerging theory was correct, this was planned in the most intimate way possible. So not with elaborate tools, not with cinematic complexity, but with knowledge. Knowledge of Nancy's trust. Knowledge of her routine. Knowledge of how to make something look like nothing happened at all. And that is the most disturbing category of offender. The one who does not need to force access, because access is given freely. The public, watching from the outside, saw only fragments of this transformation. Headlines about the reward, to speculation about an inner circle, questions about federal involvement. But inside the case, the shift was total. Nancy was no longer just a missing person. She was the center of a relational map. Every connection measured, every shared history analyzed for power dynamics. Who depended on whom? Who controlled resources? Who had something to gain from her silence? And in that map, one connection grew darker than the others. Not because of a single piece of evidence, but because everything, timelines, behavior, emotional context, began to converge. This is the moment in an investigation that feels closest to truth and furthest from closure. Because psychologically, investigators begin to understand the story. They can see how it could have happened. They can see the sequence, the trigger, the aftermath. But understanding is not the same as proving. And proving requires the one thing this case has always resisted: a break. A witness who stops protecting. A piece of forensic confirmation. A digital record that cannot be explained away. Until that happens, the person at the center of this new focus remains exactly where they have always been. Inside the circle. Untouchable in public. But under a level of scrutiny that changes every move they make. And that scrutiny has its own psychological effect. Because when someone knows they are being watched, not physically, but analytically, they begin to alter their behavior. They withdraw, and they over-explain. They attempt to control the narrative. And every attempt to control a narrative creates more data, more language to examine, more inconsistencies to compare. The question is no longer just, what happened to Nancy? The question now is, who cannot afford for the answer to be found? Because that is the axis around which this entire update turns. Not a body, not a confession, not an arrest. A shift in gravity. From a mystery in the dark to a psychological portrait forming in the light. And as Session 2 closes, the most unsettling realization is this. The reward has not simply encouraged someone to speak. It has begun to isolate someone, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, inside a community that once moved as a single unit. The circle is no longer closed. It is narrowing. And when a circle narrows around one point, it is only a matter of time before that point has to decide. Stay silent and endure the pressure. Or speak and change the entire case forever. Because investigators are no longer asking if the inner circle holds the answer. They are asking which member of that circle breaks first. And when they do, it won't just reveal what happened to Nancy. It will reveal why it happened, and why it had to be someone she trusted. Pressure does not announce the moment it becomes unbearable. It disguises itself as routine, as normal days, as carefully measured public appearances and controlled conversations. But inside the narrowing circle around Nancy's disappearance, something had already shifted, and everyone connected to the case could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. Because by the time Session 2 ended, investigators were no longer searching outward. They were watching inward. And not for a dramatic mistake, not for a confession, but for human behavior under sustained psychological strain. And that kind of observation changes the timeline of a case. The past stops being the only place where truth can be found. The present becomes evidence. Every movement matters. Every choice to speak or not speak becomes part of the profile. And the person now sitting at the center of that invisible gravity had entered a phase forensic psychologists call containment fatigue. It happens when someone has carried a version of events for too long. At first, the narrative feels stable, memorized, defended. But over time, maintaining it requires more energy than creating it did. And energy leaves traces. Investigators began to notice a pattern that had nothing to do with physical evidence. It was social. And the same individual who had once been consistently present in shared spaces, gatherings, mutual connections, routine environments, was now appearing less and less. Not disappearing, just repositioning. Choosing moments carefully, avoiding overlap with certain people, limiting unplanned interactions. That is not the behavior of someone hiding from law enforcement. That is the behavior of someone managing perception. Because law enforcement asks questions, but communities observe. And communities remember, especially when $1 million reward has turned memory into currency. The first real fracture did not come in an interview room. It came in a conversation between two people who had known each other for years. A conversation that, months earlier, would have been unremarkable. But now, every word carried weight. One of them had begun to re-examine the past, not as nostalgia, but as sequence. And sequence is dangerous. Because when you place events in the correct order, coincidence begins to collapse. Why that phone call? Why that sudden change of plan? Why that moment of tension no one understood at the time? For investigators, this was the shift they had been waiting for. Not a new witness. A new interpretation from someone already inside the story. and that interpretation aligned with the behavioral model they had been quietly building. A model that suggested Nancy's final hours were not defined by confrontation, but by familiarity. No signs of forced urgency, no chaotic disruption, which meant one thing: whatever happened began in a space where she felt safe. And safety, in cases like this, is not a location. It is a person. When you trust someone, your guard does not lower gradually. It disappears instantly. That is why relational crimes are so difficult to reconstruct. And because the critical moment, the moment when normal becomes irreversible, often looks, from the outside, exactly like every other moment that came before it. Investigators returned again to Nancy's emotional landscape in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Not just what she did, but what she was preparing to do. People close to her had begun to describe something with increasing clarity. She was changing direction. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would alarm anyone, but in a way that altered the balance of a relationship. And when you alter the balance, you introduce the possibility of loss. For most people, loss leads to grief. For a certain personality type, loss leads to control. Because control restores equilibrium. Control prevents exposure. Control keeps a narrative intact. The psychological portrait that had been forming now had sharper edges. This was not a personality defined by outward violence. This was someone methodical. Someone who managed impressions carefully. Someone who understood how they were seen and used that understanding to their advantage. Which meant that if Nancy had represented a threat to that structure, the response would not have been explosive. It would have been calculated. That calculation extended beyond the moment itself. It extended into the aftermath. Why no immediate collapse of routine? Why no visible panic? Why the continued participation in searches, in conversations, in public concern? Because the most effective concealment is not absence, it is presence, staying inside the narrative, helping to shape it, guiding the emotional tone. But time erodes performance. And as the FBI's analytical framework tightened around the case, the questions became less about what could be proven, and more about what could no longer be ignored. Digital patterns were revisited with updated technology, not to discover new messages, but to measure behavior. How long did someone pause before responding? How often did they initiate contact versus react? What changed after Nancy disappeared? Because grief has a pattern. Shock has a pattern. But so does relief. And in the months following her disappearance, one behavioral trend stood apart. Communication decreased in areas where emotional expression would have been expected, and increased in areas related to information monitoring, following coverage, asking what others knew, but tracking the direction of the investigation. That is not mourning. That is situational awareness. For investigators, it was another psychological marker. And then came the moment that, in any other case, would have been the climax. But here, it became something else. A piece of information, small, precise, and impossible to reinterpret, entered the case. Not public, not dramatic, but definitive in its implication. It did not describe the crime. It described movement. A movement that contradicted a long-held version of events. Movement that placed one person in a position they had consistently denied. This is the point where most stories would give you an arrest. But real investigations do not move at the speed of revelation. They move at the speed of proof. Because knowing is not enough. You must be able to show it. Without doubt. Without alternative explanation. So the circle tightened further. Quietly. Strategically. And the psychological effect of that tightening began to manifest in ways no forensic test could measure. Sleep disruption. changes in physical appearance, shortened temper, inconsistent speech patterns. People who interacted with this individual began to use the same word, independently. Different. Not guilty. Not suspicious. Different. And difference, in a closed social system, is isolating. The person at the center of this gravity was no longer held in the same emotional position. Trust had thinned. Conversations had become cautious. Silences had become longer, which leads to the most dangerous state for someone carrying a secret. Isolation inside a group that knows you too well, because strangers cannot read your baseline. But the people who have known you for years, they can hear the change in your voice. They can see the hesitation. They can feel the tension. And they begin to step back, not in accusation, in instinct. Investigators understood what this meant, and they had seen it before. You do not always break a case by introducing new evidence. Sometimes you allow social gravity to do the work. You let relationships shift. You let distance grow. You let the person at the center realize that the structure that once protected them no longer exists. Because when protection disappears, so does the ability to maintain the narrative. And that is where the case stands now. Not solved, not closed, but transformed. Nancy is no longer just a missing woman in a file. She is the silent presence in every interaction among the people who knew her. The question of what happened to her is no longer abstract. It is personal. It sits at dinner tables, in text messages that are typed and deleted, in phone calls that never get made. And the $1 million reward, once seen as an external force, has become internal. Because the real reward now is not the money. It is release. Release from carrying knowledge. A release from living inside a version of the past that no longer holds. Someone inside that circle knows the moment when everything changed. They know the exact sequence. They know what Nancy saw in the final seconds when trust turned into something else. And the investigators know that they know. That is the final psychological standoff. Not between law enforcement and a suspect, but between truth and loyalty. Between memory and fear. Between the life Nancy had and the secret that replaced it. And as this session closes, there is one realization that eclipses all others. Cases like this are not solved when evidence is found. They are solved when silence becomes heavier than speaking. Right now, silence is still winning, but the balance is shifting, because the circle that once protected everyone inside it has become a mirror. And in that mirror, one person is beginning to see something they cannot unsee. Not investigators, not headlines, themselves. And when that moment reaches its breaking point, and it always does, the answer to what happened to Nancy will not emerge as a discovery. It will emerge as a decision. A decision by the only person who has known the truth from the very beginning. A decision that will either keep Nancy a mystery or finally let her story end.